Hey, crew, it's Pitt, and I'm back with some more psychology. Today, we are diving into the works of Carl Jung. It is the archetypes of the collective unconscious. We will be reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people will find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue the exploration. We're beginning this one, I'm not continuing it. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there is several playlists linked in the box down below that will give you a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. If you find value, I ask that you do all of the wonderful things down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow, throw me a comment, whether you agree or disagree with anything that is stated. If you put it in the box and it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you truly find value, I ask that you hit the super chat or super thanks. Consider joining for a membership or picking up a copy of one of my books. The one most relevant to today is going to be the one in the middle. It is The Green Stone. It is my work on spiritual alchemy. It's what I consider to be the completion of Carl Jung's Mysterium Conjunctionis and his work with the archetypes. I have completely reworked the MBTI system into something that is more functional. I am sure we will be discussing that as we go along through this particular study. Um, with all of that being said, we are going to dive in and begin the exploration of the archetypes of the collective unconscious. I've I've read parts of this in fragments in specific references, never the entire thing. The work that I did with the MBTI system, that's where I went back and looked through the pieces. It was not sufficient, right, for a full understanding of where he was coming from. And so that's why we're doing this. But I do believe that the work with the MBTI system stands on its own. It really does change it from a subjective to more objective, at least typology that is more consistent and more useful with a pattern break to help you improve yourself. It's much more useful than the stuff that they use in the workplace for those various team building exercises that they do. All right. Now, the hypothesis of a collective unconscious belongs to the class of ideas that people at first find strange, but soon come to possess and use as familiar conceptions. This has been the case with the concept of the unconscious in general. After the philosophical idea of the unconscious, in the form presented chiefly by Karis von Hartmann, had gone down under the overwhelming wave of materialism and empiricism, leaving leaving hardly a ripple behind it. It gradually reappeared in the scientific domain of medical psychology. At first, the concept of the unconscious was limited to denoting the state of repressed or forgotten contents. Even with Freud, who makes the unconscious, at least metaphorically, take the stage as the acting subject, it is really nothing but the gathering place of forgotten or repressed contents and has a functional significance thanks only to these. For Freud, accordingly, the unconscious is of an exclusively personal nature, although he was aware of its archaic and mythological thought forms. A more or less superficial layer of the unconscious is undoubtedly personal. I call it the personal unconscious. But this personal unconscious rests upon a deeper layer, which does not derive from personal experience and is not a personal acquisition, but inborn. This deeper layer I call the collective unconscious. I have chosen the term collective because this part of the unconscious is not individual, but universal. In contrast to the personal psyche, it has contents and modes of behaviors that are more or less the same everywhere in all individuals. It is, in other words, identical in all men and thus constitutes a common psychic substrate of a suprapersonal nature, which is present in every one of us. Psychic existence. Wait, let's do this before we go there, right? The work with the unconscious and the subconscious and the superconscious and the conscious that I've been doing led me to the computer model, and I've been refining it as we go along. And the best way, again, to look at this is that the superconscious is the record of, right? It is the hard drive. Instead of considering it to be the whole computer, consider that to be the hard drive. The hard drive is the source from which you get the information. It is the source on which the information is stored. It is the physical result of all the changes that have happened, and it is the part that you can visibly see, touch, and do things with, tangibly. The superconscious, which is this next layer up from that, instead of thinking of that as the operating system, think about it as the thing upon which the operating system is built. So instead of it being Windows, instead it's going to be binary, like binary itself, the physical 0 and 1 that is written onto the hard drive that is then used to create the various operating systems such as Windows and Linux. And so the subconscious, that is the part that individuates, right? The superconscious is shared. It is the hard drive. Everybody that operates on the system can access the hard drive, even if it is partitioned. But the subconscious is the next layer up where the hard drive is functional. It is the potential of all of these things, and it is the record of the things that happen, but it's not the things happening. The unconscious would be the operating system, which shows you your desktop, right? So it is the individualized account on the hard drive, the partition that is yours, that where your data is accessed directly through conscious will, which is the cursor, right? The conscious is the cursor, the unconscious is the desktop, and the operating system both. The binary upon which it is based is the subconscious, and then the superconscious is going to be the very physicality, the record. It is going to be the hard drive itself. With that format in mind, right? That's the way that I'm looking at it as I read through this, because that's the way that seems to be fairly consistent with the way that it works. It's an easy way that people can reference it in a tangible means. There are other examples that can be used, but I haven't really worked those out yet in a way that I could use them. And looking at it in this particular light is something that, as far as I am aware, is somewhat unique to my viewpoint. Right? Not to say that there isn't somebody else doing it or saying it that way, but it's not somebody that I have found in particular. So, psychic existence can be recognized only by the presence of contents that are capable of consciousness. We can therefore speak of an unconscious only insofar as we are able to demonstrate its contents. The contents of the personal unconscious are chiefly the feeling toned complexes, as they are called. They constitute the personal and private side of psychic life. The contents of the collective unconscious, on the other hand, are known as the archetypes. So the personal unconscious is going to be the operating system, right? That's going to be the Windows, the unconscious part that is on top of the binary. And then this feeling tone complex is interesting because the personal unconscious is the desktop. That's leaning more towards that. Then that means that the opposite, which is thinking in the matrix, is going to be leaning into the binary, which is absolutely makes sense, right? It is much less like you can do so much with binary if you know what you were doing. Like you can literally do anything in the binary that the programs can do. It's just really hard, right? And so that's why we make the programs to translate through the binary. You can work with your subconscious directly. It's just really hard. And so we use our operating system of the unconscious to kind of pull up what we need as we need it. Clicking on the icons on the desktop is activating the conscious that is your personal unconscious, which then narrows the window down into the one direction for a limited amount of time. All right. The feeling tones complex. That's interesting, man. And then it says that the collective unconscious are known as the archetypes. And so, and that is the true, right? Like the archetypes really break down into just two, right? There is the masculine and the feminine, right? The positive and the negative, the masculine and the feminine, the creative, the stasis, the change agent, the potentiality. There's many ways to express it, but it's the duality, right? And so the archetypes break down from the duality. From the masculine, you get the masculine archetypes. From the feminine, you get the feminine archetypes. And so there are a wide variety, positive and negative, at each iteration for everything, right? You get from the masculine, you draw the father, right? That is generally one of the first, the father or the warrior. And then it is the good father and the bad father. And then it is the good warrior and the bad warrior. The same on the other side, the good mother and the bad mother, the positive or negative, the stasis or change, however you want to view it. And so the archetypes are the generalizations. And so that would fit into the binary quite well, right? On or off, right? Yes or no, positive, negative. And then from there, another binary, positive or negative. And then from there, another binary. And so it would the archetypes fit right into the computer model. The term archetype occurs as early as Philo-Judaeus with reference to the imago Dei, God image in man. It can also be found in Arrhenius, who says, the creator of the world did not fashion these things directly from himself, but copied them from archetypes outside himself. Yeah, right. Like nothing inside of the creation is the full reflection of the creator. It is all distortions of the original image, right? We don't know what the original image is. We like to think that it is our image, right? We like to think that God made us in his image, but there is no way to know that. Right? That is something that we look at a little bit pridefully, hold for ourselves. Like, of course, we're on top of the food chain. Why would it not be us, right? We don't know that we're on top of the food chain. We don't know what God looks like. We don't have any concept outside of the reflection that we see of ourselves. And so, therefore, nothing inside of the creation can fully represent the creator. And if you like the I worship God the creator, but that is not the creation, even though I adore the entirety of the creation, right? I find wonderment in the growth of trees and in plants and people and the interactions. Even some of the negative ones are a little bit fascinating. And so, but it's not about worshiping the creation. It's about appreciating the creation that the creator has given into us. God cannot exist fully inside of the creation when he's holding the creation in place. He exists outside of the creation. The entire creation is fully divine, right? It is fully expressed by God through divine will, but he is doing that outside of the creation. And so the archetypes can't be a direct reflection of the one, it has to be of the duality. And then the various iterations of the duality down the chain. Back to the text. In the Corpus Hermeticum, God is called the archetypal light. The term occurs several times in Dionysius, the Areopagite, as for instance, the Celesti Hierarcha 2, 4, immaterial archetypes, and in the Divinus Nominibus, the archetypal stone. The term archetype is not found in St. Augustine, but the idea of it is. Thus, in De Diversis Questionibus, not trying the number, he speaks of the idea principales, which are themselves not formed, but are contained in divine understanding. Archetype is an explanatory paraphrase of the Platonic eidos. For our purposes, this term is apposite and helpful because it tells us that so far as the collective unconscious contents are concerned, we are dealing with archaic, or I should say, primordial types, that is, with universal images that have existed since the remotest times. The term representation collectives, used by Levi Bru, To denote these symbolic figures in the primitive view of the world could easily be applied to the unconscious content as well, since it means practically the same thing. Primitive tribal lore is concerned with archetypes that have been modified in a special way. They are no longer contents of the unconscious, but have already been changed into the conscious formulae taught according to tradition, generally in the form of esoteric teaching. The last is a typical means of expression for the transmission of collective contents originally derived from the unconscious. And most of the archetypes are going to be derivatives, right? The hero archetype, it's going to be some mythical story that you are told so that you know it. So it'll be Heracles or, the stories of Thor or whatever it happens to be. And so you will absolutely frame, your understanding of the individual archetype through the lens of that which you already know, right? So if you grow up knowing these people as the representatives of the gods, then that is the lens that you use for that. And that is fairly equally applied across all understandings. Um, and so uh, it means practically the same thing. Primitive tribal lore, right? That is where the differentiations of the archetypes from the binary, right? The binary is just positive, negative, male, female, creative, so stasis, right? Don't change or change. And so from that, we derive these others, right? The masculine denotes into the male, female, or the father and warrior and the cunning trickster and whatever. And then the female goes into the mother and the crone and the various iterations that exist. And so, and it is shaped through the collective teachings of Esoterica, generally speaking. So I am in agreement. Another well known expression of the archetypes is myth and fairy tale. But here too, we are dealing with forms that have received a specific stamp and have been handed down through long periods of time. The term archetype thus applies only indirectly to the representation collective, since it designates only those psychic contents which have not yet been submitted to conscious elaboration, and, therefore, an immediate datum of psychic experience. In this sense, there is a considerable difference between the archetype and the historical formula that has evolved, especially on the higher levels of esoteric teaching. The archetypes appear in a form that reveals, quite unmistakably, the critical and evaluating influence of conscious elaboration. Their immediate manifestation, as we encounter it in dreams and visions, is much more individual, less understandable, and more naive than in myths. For example, the archetypes is essentially an unconscious content that is altered by becoming conscious and by being perceived, and it takes its color from the individual consciousness in which it happens to appear. And that is the thing with the spiritual experiences, right? You experience the spiritual through the lens which you have, and so if you are of Far Eastern descent, you might see Shiva or one of those expressions. And if you are of Judeo Christian descent, you will probably see Jesus or of that. And if you are Jewish, you might see Moses or Joshua, right? You're going to see what your lens will see. And so that is, again, absolutely true. What the word archetype means in the nominal sense is clear enough. Then, from its relations with myth, esoteric teaching, and fairy tale. But if we try to establish what an archetype is psychologically, the matter becomes more complicated. So far, mythologists have always helped themselves out with solar, lunar, meteorological, vegetal, and others of the kind. The fact that myths are first and foremost psychic phenomena that reveal the nature of the soul is something they have absolutely refused to see until now. Primitive man is not much interested in objective explanations of the obvious, but he has an imperative need, or rather, his unconscious psyche has an irresistible urge to assimilate all outer sense experiences to inner psychic events. It is not enough for the primitive to see the sun rise and set. This external observation must at the same time be a psychic happening. The sun in its course must represent the fate of a god or hero who, in the last analysis, dwells nowhere except in the soul of man. All the mythologized processes of nature, such as summer and winter, the phases of the moon, the rainy seasons, and so forth, are in no sense allegories of these objective occurrences. They are rather, they are symbolic expressions of the inner, unconscious drama of the psyche, which becomes accessible to man's consciousness by way of projection, that is, mirrored in the events of nature. The projection is so fundamental that it has taken several thousand years of civilization to detach it in some measure from its outer object. In the case of astrology, for instance, this age old scientia intuitiva came to be branded as rank heresy because man had not yet succeeded in making the psychological description of character independent of the stars. Even today, people who still believe in astrology fall almost without exception for the old superstitious assumption of the influence of the stars. And yet, anyone who can calculate a horoscope should know that since the days of Hipparchus of Alexandria, the spring point has been fixed at 0 degrees Aries, and that the zodiac on which every horoscope is based is therefore quite arbitrary, the spring point having gradually advanced since then into the first degree of Pisces, owing to the precession of the equinoxes. Um, there is something to that, right? I did an investigation into astrology and I did not find much reason to believe in astrology. I have a video on it. Primitive man impresses us so strongly with his subjectivity that we should really have guessed long ago that myths refer to something psychic. His knowledge of nature is essentially the language and outer dress of an unconscious psychic process. But the very fact that this process is unconscious gives us the reason why man has thought of everything except the psyche in his attempts to explain myths. He simply didn't know that the psyche contains all the images that have ever given rise to myths, and that our unconscious is an acting and suffering subject with an inner drama, which primitive man rediscovers by means of analogy and the process of nature, both great and small. The stars of thine own fate lie in thy breast, says Sini to Wallenstein, a dictum that should satisfy all astrologers if we knew even a little about the secrets of the heart. But for this, so far, men have had little understanding, nor would I dare assert that things are any better today. Tribal lore is always sacred and dangerous. All esoteric teachings seek to apprehend the unseen happenings in the psyche, and all claim supreme authority for themselves. What is true of primitive lore is true in even higher degree of the ruling world religions. They contain a revealed knowledge that was originally hidden, and they set forth the secrets of the soul in glorious images. Their temples and their sacred writings proclaim in image and word the doctrine hallowed from old, making it accessible to every believing heart, every sensitive vision, every farthest range of thought. Indeed, we are compelled to say that the more beautiful, the more sublime, the more comprehensive the image that has evolved and been handed down by tradition, the further removed it is from individual experience. We can just feel our way into it and sense something of it, but the original experience has been lost. Why is psychology the youngest of the empirical sciences? Why have we not long since discovered the unconscious and raised up its treasure house of eternal images? Simply because we had a religious formula for everything psychic, and one that is far more beautiful and comprehensive than immediate experience. Through the Christian view of the world, though the Christian view of the world has paled for many people, these symbolic treasure rooms of the East are still full of marvels that can nourish for a long time to come the passion for show and new clothes. What is more, these images, be they Christian or Buddhist or what you will, are lovely, mysteriously, richly intuitive. Naturally, the more familiar we are with them, the more does constant usage polish them smooth. So that what remains is only banal superficiality and meaningless paradox. The mystery of the virgin birth, or the homoousia of the Son with the Father, or the Trinity, which is nevertheless not a triad. These no longer lend rings to any philosophical fancy. I have the answer to most of those things, right? There was no literal virgin birth. That was an entire lie. Uh, then that was a misinterpreted property prophecy that was misapplied to an event that probably never happened. The Son and the Father is an expression of the duality, right? It is the positive change agents. It is not any particular entities. And the Trinity is indeed body, mind, and soul. Um, and I can explain those in much greater detail for a long period of time. And that it is fairly objectively done. They have stiffened into more mere objects of belief. So it is not surprising if the religious need, the believing mind, and the philosophical speculations of the educated European are attracted by the symbols of the East, those grandiose conceptions of divinity in India, and the abysms of the Taoist philosophy in China. Just as once before the heart and mind of men of antiquity were gripped by Christian ideas. There are many Europeans who began by surrendering completely to the influence of the Christian symbol until they landed themselves in a Kierkegaardian neurosis, or whose relation to God, owing to the progressive impoverishment of symbolism, developed into an unbearably sophisticated I-U relationship, only to fall victims in their turn to the magic and novelty of the Eastern symbols. This surrender is not necessarily a defeat. Rather, it proves the receptiveness and vitality of the religious sense. We can observe much the same thing in the educated Oriental, who not infrequently feels drawn to the Christian symbol or to the science that is so unsuited to the Oriental mind, and even develops an enviable understanding of them. That people should succumb to these eternal images is entirely normal. In fact, it is what these images are for. They are meant to attract, to convince, to fascinate, and to overpower. They are created out of the primal stuff of revelation and reflect the ever unique experience of divinity. That is why they always give man a premonition of the divine, while at the same time safeguarding him from the immediate experience of it. Thanks to the labors of the human spirit over the centuries, these images have become embedded in a comprehensive system of thought that ascribes an order to the world and are at the same time represented by a mighty, far spread, and venerable institution called the church. Uh, I take exception with that word. I can best illustrate my meaning by taking an example the Swiss mystic and hermit Brother Nicholas of Flue, who has recently been canonized. Probably his most important religious experience was the so called Trinity vision, which preoccupied him to such an extent that he painted it, or had it painted, on the wall of his cell. The painting is still preserved in the parish church at Sachsen. It is a mandala divided into six parts, and in the center is the crowned countenance of God. Now, we know that Brother Klaus investigated the nature of his vision with the help of an illustrated devotional booklet by a German mystic, and he struggled to get his original experience into a form he could understand. He occupied himself with it for years. This is what I call the elaboration of the symbol. His reflections on the nature of the vision, influenced as they were by the mystic diagrams he used as a guiding thread, inevitably led him to the conclusion that he must have gazed upon the Holy Trinity itself, the summum bonum, eternal love. This is borne out by the expurgated version now in Saxon. The original experience, however, was entirely different. In his ecstasy, there was revealed to Brother Klaus a sight so terrible that his own countenance was changed by it. So much so, indeed, that people were terrified and felt afraid of him. What he had seen was a vision of the utmost intensity. Wolflin, our oldest source, writes as follows. All who came to him were filled with terror at first glance. As to the cause of this, he himself used to say that he had seen a piercing light resembling a human face. At the sight of it, he feared that his heart would burst into little pieces. Therefore, overcome with terror, he instantly turned his face away and fell to the ground. And that was the reason why his face was now terrible to others. Interesting, right? A visible light resembling a human face that was overwhelmingly terrifying. If you are familiar with A House Built Upon Shifting Sands or an unconventional Bible study, you will know that I believe in entities and that I believe that there are positive entities and negative entities that exist in a dimension that we probably don't understand at all. That they are often mistaken for aliens or genies or a variety of other things, and that some of them influence for the betterment, some of them influence for the detriment. And the ones that make you scared are the ones that you should stay away from. This vision has rightly been compared with the one in Revelation 1:13, that strange apocalyptic Christ image, which, for sheer gruesomeness and singularity, is surpassed only by the monstrous seven eyed lamb with seven horns. Revelation 5:6. It is certainly very difficult to see what is the relationship between this figure and the Christ of the Gospels. That is because Revelation is an allegory, not a literal prophecy. And that is one of those problems with prophecy, right? People are going to take it how they want to take it. It doesn't matter. Like, if it was prophecy, which it probably was not, it was about Nero and the Roman sack of the temple, where they took down the temple and left not a single stone standing upon another one, where they laid waste to the entire people and scattered them among the nations, where they literally surrounded Rome with armies and or surrounded Jerusalem with armies and literally killed people. Right? When the things literally played out is probably when it literally meant. And so we're talking Nero. And see one of the final chapters in my book. Hence, Brother Klaus's vision was interpreted in a quite definite way by the earliest sources. In 1508, the humanist Carbovillus Charles de Bouels wrote to a friend, I wish to tell you of a vision which appeared to him in the sky on a night when the stars were shining, and he stood in prayer and contemplation. He saw the head of a human figure with a terrifying face full of wrath and threats. This interpretation agrees perfectly with the modern amplification furnished by Revelation 1:13, nor should we forget Brother Klaus's other visions, for instance, of Christ and the bearskin, of God the Father and God the Mother, and of himself as the Son. That's not a bad one. They exhibit features which are very undogmatic indeed. And now, I'm unfamiliar with Brother Klaus or his other visions, but, right, this implication here, right? God the Father and God the Mother, and yourself, whoever you are, as the son or daughter, doesn't matter, is a better representative, right? You, as the divine representative of deciding, and then the positive father and the negative mother, not good and bad, but literal positive potential for change, negative stasis energy. Uh, those two things and you do indeed form part of the Trinity, right? The Trinity is actually four pieces. Those Father and Mother is one, and you have Source, which is divided into the positive and negative Mother and Father, which is then combined into you. Traditionally, this great vision was brought in connection with the Trinity picture in the church at Saxon. And so, likewise, was the wheel symbolism in the so called Pilgrim's Tract. Brother Klaus, we are told, showed the picture of the wheel to the visiting pilgrim. Evidently, this picture had preoccupied him for some time. Blank is of the opinion that, contrary to the tradition, there is no connection between the vision and the Trinity picture. This skepticism seems to me to go too far. There must have been some reason for Brother Klaus's interest in the wheel. Visions like the one he had often cause mental confusion and disintegration. Witness the heart bursting into little pieces. Yes, being unprepared for a naturally occurring vision, which is a thing, right? You can The body produces its own hallucinogen. And this is produced when you are born and when you die as a definite with zero hesitation. When they have done the test, they know that you do indeed create DMT in your brain as a hallucinatory effect when you are born and when you die. It is also produced spontaneously in small doses when you sleep, and you can, I am fully and firmly convinced, stimulate that production for yourself through the flexation of your third eye muscles. There are muscles that surround the energy locus that is the chakra system, and you can flex it. You can yawn, and that is one way that it is flexed. Now, don't don't do that without taking all of the proper precautions. I have those available in video and in print format. The book I sell, an unconventional a series of unconventional beliefs, details how to do that correctly, right? And it is available. I read it to you in the playlist, a series of unconventional beliefs, so that you can do it correctly, free, right? You don't have to pay for it. And so if you are more interested in that particular thing, that is where to go for that. But you can stimulate, right? And it is the same, more controlled for me, right? I can get smaller doses than taking a mushroom, right? A cow shed mushroom that I I don't recommend doing simply because it is opening a gate that you might not be ready for. And not being ready for those particular gates can lead to some traumatic understandings such as we are witnessing being talked about here with Brother Klaus. He may have taken something, he may have had a natural stimulation through the meditative process. That is a thing that you can do. It is part of the process that will be revealed to you if you are balancing yourself in the ways that I described. And so, this to me is a probable, right? He probably did stimulate the throne room experience and did not know how to deal with that at all, and it caused him some problems. It's one of the reasons why I tell you that it is better to be balanced and ready to do it before you do it. And that if you have to use something else to open the day gate, then you probably don't need the gate open yet. Now, once you can open the gate for yourself, if you want to participate with the narcotics and the hallucinogens that actually make that happen, once you are prepared for the gate to be open, you can utilize that as a tool to do so. But beware because using outside chemicals, they are not clean, right? The DMT that you produce is clean. The very near to DMT, psilocybin that is produced in that mushroom is not clean, right? It is the closest to clean, but it is not clean. And so be very careful with how often that you open that particular gate in that particular way. All right. We know from experience that the protective circle, the mandala, is the traditional antidote for chaotic states of mind. It is therefore only too clear. And the reason for the mandala is that is what you see, right? When you enter into the state of alternateness that allows you into these places, right? You see the mandala, right? The reality begins to shift in a way that is very similar to the mandala. You see an emanation point and it expands in a way that is almost identical to any expression of a mandala. And so it is very understandable why the mandala is the expression of the spiritual experience, right? Now, whether or not Jung ever actually partook of that or only got around the fringes of that, right? I am more leaning towards he only was on the fringe, that he did not take the step across because he was so very close to an understanding and that he did not get. That is why I had to do my book on the green stone because there was a step he wouldn't take. Back to the text. It is therefore only too clear why Brother Klaus was fascinated by the symbol of the wheel. The interpretation of the terrifying vision as an experience of God need not be so wide of the mark either. The connection between the great vision and the Trinity picture, and of both with the wheel symbol, therefore, seem to me very probable on psychological grounds. This vision, undoubtedly fearful and highly perturbing, which burst like a volcano upon his religious view of the world, without any dogmatic prelude and without exegetical, yeah, like it's exegesis, and it is, and without exegetical commentary, naturally needed a long labor of assimilation in order to fit into the total structure of the psyche and thus restore the disturbed psychic balance. Brother Klaus came to terms with his experience on the basis of dogma, then firm as a rock. And the dogma proved its powers of assimilation by turning something horribly alive into the beautiful abstraction of the Trinity idea. But the reconciliation might have taken place on a quite different basis, based on by the vision itself and its unearthly actuality, much to the disadvantage of the Christian conception of God, and no doubt to the still greater disadvantage of Brother Klaus himself, who would then have become not a saint but a heretic, if not a lunatic, and would have probably have ended his life at the stake. That is the problem with enlightenment in the past few centuries, as a matter of fact. That is why the secret societies ever existed. That is why, right? The up until the past 250 years, the entire history of mankind was some form of tyranny or another. Unless you were living entirely isolated from other people, you were under the foot of someone, right? And so, uh, for a large section of the peoples, that was the Catholic Church, and any deviation from the dogma of the Catholic Church was a really good way to catch yourself on fire, or to be thrown into a river, or to be pulled apart by horses, or burned alive in metal instruments, or a wide variety of really horrifying things. And so, if you had any doubts, you did not express them unless you were part of this little club, and this little club would take you and make sure that you were solid enough to share secrets with, and then they would clue you in. They'd be like, hey, this isn't real, right? And you're going to have to live a double life from this point forward. You're going to have to pretend to the entire rest of the world that you still believe the things that you used to, because if not, they will kill you. But here's what really it is. Here's what it really is. And that was the point of the secret societies. That was the whole reason we had them, to escape the persecution. And then not just the Catholic Church, right? Secret societies existed in Egypt. Back to the text. This example demonstrates the use of dogmatic symbol. It formulates a tremendous and dangerously decisive psychic experience, fittingly called an experience of the divine, in a way that is tolerable to our human understanding, without either limiting the scope of the experience or doing damage to its overwhelming significance. The vision of divine wrath, which we also meet in Jacob Boehme, ill accords with the God of the New Testament, the loving Father in heaven, and for this reason it might easily have become the source of an inner conflict that would have been quite in keeping with the spirit of the age, and the end of the 15th century, the time of Nicholas Cusanus, whose formula of the complexio oppositorium anxiously anticipated the schism that was imminent. Not long afterwards, the Yahwistic conception of God went through a series of rebirths in Protestantism. Yahweh is a God concept that contains the opposites in a still undivided state. That's one interpretation of that entity. Brother Klaus put himself outside the beaten track of convention and habit by leaving his home and family, living alone for years, and gazing deep into the dark mirror, so that the wondrous and terrible boon of original experience befell him. In this situation, the dogmatic image of divinity that had been developed over the centuries worked like a healing draught. It helped him to assimilate the fatal incursion of an archetypal image and so escape being torn asunder. Angelus Silesius was not so fortunate. The inner conflict tore him to pieces, because in his day, the stability of the church that dogma guarantees was already shattered. Not shattered enough. Man, I got 43 points of contention. I didn't nail them to a wall, but I put them on the internet. Jacob Boehm, too, knew a god of the wrath fire, a real dose of Scontius. He was able to bridge the profound and agonizing contradiction on the one hand by means of the Christian formula of Father and Son, and embodied it speculatively in his view of the world, which, though Gnostic, was in all essential points Christian. Otherwise, he would have become a dualist. On the other hand, it was undoubtedly alchemy, long brewing the union of opposites in secret, that came to his aid. Here's one of those secret societies. Nevertheless, the opposition has left obvious traces in the mandala appended to his 25 questions concerning the soul, showing the nature of divinity. The mandala is divided into a dark and light half, and the semicircles that are drawn round them, instead of joining up to form a ring, are turned back to back. Dogma takes the place of the collective unconscious by formulating its contents on a grand scale. The Catholic way of life is completely unaware of the psychological problems in this sense. Almost the entire of the collective unconscious has been channeled into the dogmatic archetypal ideas and flows along like a well controlled stream in the symbolism of creed and ritual. It manifests itself in the inwardness of the Catholic psyche. The collective unconscious, as we understand it today, was never a matter of psychology, for before the Christian church existed, there were antique mysteries, and these reach back into the gray mist of Neolithic prehistory. Mankind has never lacked powerful images to lend magical aid against all the uncanny things that live in the depths of the psyche. Always the figures of the unconscious were expressed in protecting and healing images, and in this way, they were expelled from the psyche into cosmic space, right? Like dream catchers. That's an expression of this, right? The iconography of the cross is an expression of this. All of like any one of the articles of faith that people will trust to protect them, and of rabbit's foot, all of that, still the same thing. The iconoclasm of the Reformation, however, quite literally made a breach in the protective wall of sacred images, and since then, one image after another has crumbled away. They became dubious, but they conflicted with awakened reason. Besides, people had long since forgotten what they meant. Or, had they really forgotten? Could it be that men had never really known what they meant? And that only in recent times did it occur to the Protestant part of mankind that actually we haven't had the remotest conception of what is meant by the virgin birth, the divinity of Christ, and the complexities of the Trinity? It almost seems as if these images had just lived, and as if their living existence had simply been accepted without question and without reflection. Much as everyone decorates Christmas trees or hides Easter eggs without ever knowing what these customs mean. That is two very, very good examples, right? Christmas trees are literally expressly denied to the believer. Expressly. It is one of the things that God Himself is said to have expressly denied. Do not bring the cedar trees into your home and decorate them with lights as the pagans do. Quite literally. Right? What do we do? In celebration of the divine. Now, I don't believe that particular understanding. And I am not a Yahwist. I am not under the Judaic understanding in the slightest way, but I'm also not a Christian. And so I can see that these things do not go together. They are absolutely intrinsically opposite, right? You cannot build a religion based upon God has said these things, right? And then deviate from the things that God has said. And so that is an enormous contradiction. It's one of the things that started waking me up to Christianity. And then Easter eggs. Easter eggs is another wonderful, right? Because first off, what does that have to do with anything? Well, a Christian will apologize and they will tell you, well, the egg symbolizes rebirth. Okay, well, you kill it, right? You boil it. You make it where it cannot be born again. You go and hide it, and then when you get it, you break it apart and you eat it. Or you leave it there and it stinks, right? But outside of that particular analogy of rebirth, it is not part of mythology whatsoever. There's no part of an egg, right? But in Ishtar, which is etymologically the exact same word, Esther, Easter, and Ishtar are the same word. And so the worship of Ishtar, well, there is a rabbit and there is an egg, and it is intrinsic to her and it is tied to spring. Well, there's where you got your reference, right? It has absolutely nothing to do with the death and rebirth of Jesus Christ, but it was to help the pagans to fit into the Catholic Church. And so they celebrated on that day, right? Those are two excellent examples. The fact that the archetypal images are so packed with meaning in themselves that people never think of asking, what do they really mean? That the gods die from time to time is due to man's sudden discovery that they do not mean anything, that they are made by human hands, useless idols of wood and stone. Correct. Anything inside of the creation is not the creator. In reality, however, he has merely discovered that up until then, he has never thought about his images at all. That part, that part right there. And when he starts thinking about them, he does so with the help of what he calls reason, which, in point of fact, is nothing more than the sum total of all his prejudices with myopic views. It is an interesting fact, right? And I don't use the word fact casually. It is an interesting fact that most of the people who begin seminary do not finish seminary. And it is another absolute fact that for most of them, it is not academic reasons, it is not financial considerations, it is they lose their faith through the study of the faith. They get there and they say, wait, there's no way that this can be true. And most of the people who leave the seminary do not return to the church. These are all facts. They are not supposition. This is not me speculating or being bitter or anything like that, right? I It is through the examination of the faith that you can fall away from that particular faith. It did that for me. I did it publicly. There is 161 videos of me reading the Bible and falling away from the Bible. And to come to a better understanding, you have to get rid of the old understanding. And that's exactly what I did. And it was so important that I wrote a book with 43 points of contention where I codified that. I solidified those problems into only 43 of the points. There were more, right? I tried to keep it to the points that were primarily discredited by the Bible itself and that were more objectively provable, right? Through archaeological evidence or through something of that nature. Some of the things that are definitely contradictory to understandings are more speculative. And so I didn't put those in the book, but they are in the Bible study. So the history of Protestantism has been one of chronic iconoclasm. One wall fell after another fell. And the work of destruction was not too difficult once the authority of the church had been shattered. We all know how, in large things as in small, in general as well as in particular, piece after piece collapsed, and how the alarming poverty of symbols that is now the condition of our life came about. With that, the power of the church has vanished too. A fortress, robbed of its bastions and casemates, a house whose walls have been plucked away, exposed to all the winds of the world and to all dangers. Sorry. Although this is, properly speaking, a lamentable collapse that offends our sense of history, the disintegration of Protestantism into nearly 400 denominations is yet a sure sign that the restlessness continues. I brought it back to the binary, right? I got above the operating systems, hopefully, in what I do. And so, yeah, the disintegration is inevitable. It cannot help but happen. The Protestant is cast out into a state of defenselessness that might well make the natural man shudder. His enlightened consciousness, of course, refuses to take cognizance of this fact and is quietly looking elsewhere for what has been lost to Europe. We seek the effect of images, the thought forms, that satisfy the restlessness of heart and mind and we find the treasures of the East. There is no objection to this in and for itself. Nobody forced the Romans to import Asiatic cults in bulk. If Christianity had really been, as so often described, alien to the Germanic tribes, they could easily have rejected it when the prestige of the Roman legions began to wane. But Christianity had come to stay because it fits in with the existing archetypal pattern. In the course of the centuries, however, it turned into something its founder might well have wondered had he lived to see it. And the Christianity of the Negroes and other dark skinned converts is certainly an occasion for historical reflections. Why, then, should the West not assimilate Eastern forms? The Romans, too, went to Eleusis, Samothrace, and Egypt in order to get themselves initiated. In Egypt, there even seems to have been a regular tourist trade in this commodity. The gods of Greece and Rome perished from the same disease that did our Christian symbols. People discovered then, as today, that they had no thoughts whatever on the subject. On the other hand, the gods of the strangers still had unexhausted mana. Their names were weird and incomprehensible, and their deeds portentously dark, something altogether different from the hackneyed chronique scandaleuse of Olympus. At least one couldn't understand the Asiatic symbols, and for this reason they were not banal like the conventional gods. The fact that people accepted the new as unthinkingly as they had rejected the old did not become a problem at that time. Hey Jen, how's it going? Is it becoming a problem today? Shall we be able to put on like a new suit of clothes, ready made symbols grown on foreign soil, saturated with foreign blood, spoken in a foreign tongue, nourished by a foreign culture, interwoven with foreign history, and so resemble a beggar who wrapped himself in kingly raiment? A king who disguises himself as a beggar? No doubt this is possible. Or is there something in ourselves that commands us to go in for no mummeries, but perhaps even to sew our garment ourselves? I appreciate it. Much love, Jen. I appreciate it. You been doing all right? I am convinced that the growing impoverishment of symbols has a meaning. It has a development that has an inner consistency, everything that we have not thought about, and that has therefore been deprived of a meaningful connection with our developing consciousness has got lost. If we now try to cover our nakedness with the gorgeous trappings of the East, as the Theosophists do, we would be playing our own history false. Theosophy is not a wise idea. See my work on Aleister Crowley if you are wondering about that. A man does not sink down to beggary, only to pose afterwards as an Indian potentate. It seems to me that, and he's calling him out too. It seems to me that it would be far better, stylishly, to avow our spiritual poverty, our symbollessness. I appreciate you popping in. I really do. I know this ain't the format for everybody, so people roll in and out all of the time. We are surely the rightful heirs of Christian symbolism, but somehow we have squandered this heritage. We have let the house our fathers built fall into decay, and now we try to break into Oriental palaces that our fathers never knew. Anyone who has lost the historical symbols and cannot be satisfied with substitutes is certainly in a very difficult position today. Before him, there yawns the void, and he turns away from it in horror. What is worse, the vacuum gets filled with absurd political and social ideas, which one and all are distinguished by their spiritual bleakness. But if he cannot get along with these pedantic dogmatisms, he sees himself forced to be serious for once with his alleged trust in God, although it usually turns out that his fear of things going wrong, if he did so, is even more persuasive. This fear is far from unjustified, for where God is closest, the danger seems greatest. It is dangerous to avow spiritual poverty, for the poor man has desires, and whoever has desires calls down some fatality on himself. A Swiss proverb puts it drastically. Behind every rich man stands a devil, and behind every poor man, too. God is good all the time. or ambivalent. Yeah. Just as in Christianity, the vow of worldly poverty turned the mind away from the riches of this earth, so spiritual poverty seeks to renounce the false riches of the spirit in order to withdraw not only from the sorry remnants, which today we call themselves the Protestant Church of a great past, but also from all the allurements of the odious East, in order, finally, to dwell with itself alone, where, in the cold light of consciousness, the blank barrenness of the world reaches the very stars. We have inherited this poverty from our fathers. I well remember the confirmation lesson I received at the hands of my own father. The catechism bored me unspeakably. One day I was turning over the pages of my little book in the hope of finding something interesting when my eye fell on the paragraphs about the Trinity. This interested me at once, and I waited impatiently for the lessons to get to that section. But when the longed for lesson arrived, my father said, "We'll skip this bit. I can't make head nor tail of it myself." With that, my last hope was laid in the grave. I admired my father's honesty, but this did not alter the fact that from then on, all talk of religion bored me to death. Our intellect has achieved the most tremendous things, but in the meantime, our spiritual dwelling has fallen into disrepair. We are absolutely convinced that even with the aid of the latest and largest reflecting telescope now being built in America, men will discover behind the farthest nebulae no fiery empyrean, and we will know that our eyes will wander despairingly through the dead emptiness of interstellar space. Nor is it any better when mathematical physics reveals to us the world of the infinitely small. In the end, we dig we dig up the wisdom of all ages and peoples, only to find that everything most dear and precious to us has already been said in the most superb language. Like greedy children, we stretch out our hands and think that if only we could grasp it, we could possess it too. But what we possess is no longer valid, and our hands grow weary from the grasping, for riches lie everywhere, as far as the eye can reach. All these possessions turn to water, and more than one sorcerer's apprentice has been drowned in the waters called up by himself. If he did not first succumb to the saving delusion that this wisdom was good and that was bad. It is from these adepts that there come those terrifying invalids who think they have a prophetic mission, for the artificial sundering of true and false wisdom creates a tension in the psyche, and from this there arises a loneliness and a craving, like that of the morphine addict who always hopes to find companions in his vice. Very interesting. A lot of people think that Jung was an INFJ, and I say that he was not. Right? He does appear to be self. Right? He is an I. He does appear to be ideas, and so he is an N. He does appear to be fairly flexible, and that makes him an F. But he is absolutely not narrowing down into one freaking idea. Right? That is absolutely not what he does. He does not ever commit to a singular idea. Right? He gives you many theories about what he thinks might be. He's an NE. He is not an NI. And so he's an INFP. Like there is no way that this man is an INFJ. And that was his whole problem, was that he couldn't commit to the idea that it can be both the spiritual and the material. Right? And that was his whole problem. That's why he couldn't finish his work on alchemy. Back to the text. For the artificial sundering of true and false wisdom creates a tension in the way we did that. When our natural inheritance has been dissipated, then the spirit too, as Heraclitus says, has descended from its fiery heights. Yeah, yeah, he does say that. And of those fiery heights, that is the masculine fiery energy. But when spirit becomes heavy, it turns to water. Yes, yes, it does. That is that feminine stasis energy. And with Luciferian presumption, the intellect usurps the seat where once the spirit was enthroned. And that's where the throw off gets. The spirit may legitimately claim the patria potestas over the soul. Not so the earthborn intellect, which is man's sword or hammer, and not a creator of spiritual worlds, the father of the soul. Hence, Ludwig Klages and Max Scheler were moderate enough in their attempts to rehabilitate the spirit, for both were children of an age in which the spirit was no longer up above, but down below, no longer fire, but water. And see, the spirit is both fire and water, right? The earth is the body, the air is the soul, the fire and the water are the spirit. That is the Trinity. God is the source, that would be the earth. You are the soul, that would be the air. And the Holy Spirit, the facilitator of life, is both the masculine and the feminine. Therefore, the way of the soul in search of its lost father, like Sophia seeking Bithos, leads to the water, to the dark mirror that reposes at its bottom. There is a circulation indeed. Whoever has elected for the state of spiritual poverty, the true heritage of Protestantism carried to its logical conclusion, goes the way of the soul that leads to the water, without enough consideration for the fire. Life is a balance. You are meant to have things, but you are not meant to have all the things. You are not better because you are poor. This water is no figure of speech, but a living symbol of the dark psyche. I can best illustrate this by a concrete example, one out of many. A Protestant theologian often dreamed the same dream. He stood upon a mountain slope with a deep valley below, and in it a dark lake. He knew in the dream that something had always prevented him from approaching the lake. This time he resolved to go to the water. As he approached the shore, everything grew dark and uncanny, and a gust of wind suddenly rushed over the face of the water. He was seized by a panic, fear, and awoke. This dream shows us natural symbolism. I'm going to give you mine, right? He knows the change is coming and he's kind of scared of it. And so he approaches the lake, which is the symbol of stasis. As he gets close to the thing that brings him comfort, the symbol of stasis, a gust of wind, the symbol of change, comes and strikes him in the face, making him scared because he wants the stasis. He is scared of the change that is coming. Back to the text. The dreamer descends into his own depths, and the way leads him to the mysterious water. And now there occurs the miracle of the pool of Bethesda. An angel comes down and touches the water, endowing it with healing power. In the dream, it is the wind, the pneuma, which bloweth where it listeth. That is what? Man, you are reading something into that is not there. Right? Now, I did too, right? I put my own interpretation on it, but where's the angel? It doesn't say there's an angel. It says a gust of wind. It doesn't say anything about an angel. You are interpreting through your lens that there is an angel, that this is related to Bethesda at all. Bethesda is that when the water stirred from the angel, you went and got in the water. You didn't run from it in terror. That wasn't Bethesda at all. That is a completely different understanding of the very idea, right? That is the opposite, in fact. Man's descent to the water is needed in order to evoke the miracle of its coming to life. But the breath of the Spirit rushing over the dark water is uncanny, like everything whose cause we do not know, since it is not ourselves. It hints at an unseen presence, a numen to which neither human expectations nor the machinations of the will have given life. It lives of itself, and a shudder runs through the man who thought that the Spirit was merely what he believes, what he makes himself, what is said in books, or what people talk about. And when it happens spontaneously, it is a spookish thing, and primitive fear seizes the naive mind. The elders of the Elganai tribe in Kenya gave me exactly the same description of the nocturnal god, whom they call the maker of fear. He comes to you, they said, like a cold gust of wind, and you shudder, or he goes whistling around in the tall grass. An African Pan who glides among the reeds in the haunted noontide hour, playing on his pipes and frightening the shepherds. Thus, in the dream, the breath of the Numa frightened another pastor, a shepherd of the flock, who in the darkness of the night trod the reed grown shore in the deep valley of the psyche. Yes, that erstwhile fiery spirit has made a descent to the realm of nature, to the trees and rocks, and the waters of the psyche, like the old man in Nietzsche's Zarathustra, who, wearied with mankind, withdrew into the forest to growl with the bears in honor of the Creator. Yet Nietzsche was unhinged. I did thus spake Zarathustra. If you were interested, we must surely go the way of the waters, which always tend downward. And if we would raise up the treasure, the precious heritage of the Father, in the Gnostic hymn to the soul, the son is sent forth by his parents to seek the pearl that fell from the king's crown. It lies at the bottom of a deep well, guarded by a dragon, in the land of the Egyptians, that land of flesh pots and drunkenness, with all its material and spiritual riches. The son and heir sets out to fetch the jewel, but forgets himself and his task in the orgies of the Egyptian worldliness, until a letter from his father reminds him what his duty is. He then sets out for the water and plunges into the dark depths of the well, where he finds the pearl at the bottom, and, in the end, offers it to the highest divinity. This hymn, ascribed to Bardesanes, dates from an age that resembled ours in more than one respect. Mankind looked and waited, and it was a fish, levatas de profundo, drawn from the deep, that became the symbol of the Savior, the bringer of healing. As I wrote these lines, I received a letter from Vancouver, from a person unknown to me. The writer is puzzled by his dreams, which are always about water. Almost every time I dream, it is about water. Either I am having a bath, or the water closet is overflowing, or a pipe is bursting, or my home has drifted down to the water's edge, or I see an acquaintance about to sink into water, or I'm trying to get out of water and I'm having a bath and the tub is about to overflow, etc. You need some change in your life. Water is the commonest symbol for the unconscious. The lake in the valley is the unconscious, which lies, as it were, underneath consciousness. I disagree. Right? I'd say that water is going to be the representative of the subconscious, that fire is going to be the symbol for the consciousness. It is the active agent of change. And that air is the symbol of the soul, which is the deciding factor. And earth is the super conscious, which is the record that is written, right? The collective unconscious. And so I don't agree with water being the symbol for the unconscious. And I've went through the whys in extensive detail in the Mysterium Conjunctionis. And so if you are interested in it, it is there. We talk about it a lot more, but water really is the agent of stasis, where fire is the agent of change. And so the unconscious is going to be the level where change can occur through conscious effort. The subconscious is going to be the part where change does occur, but it occurs from the change agent, which is the step above. It filters through all the way to the superconscious. And so your ego writes into the unconscious. It writes on the desktop into the program, whereas the subconscious is actually like the binary, and the superconscious is the hard drive. All right. Which lies, as it were, underneath consciousness, so that it is often referred to as the subconscious, usually with a pejorative connotation of an inferior consciousness. Water is the valley spirit, the water dragon of Tao, and that brought it more into alignment with what I was saying. So, whose nature resembles water, a yang embraced in the yin. I do have a tendency to stop right when it strikes me, and then it gets explained in the next couple of sentences. But that is a much better explanation, right? That it is mistaken or often referred to as the subconscious is a better appellation for the water. Psychologically, therefore, water means spirit that has become unconscious. Kind of. So the dream of the theologian is quite right in telling him that down by the water, he could experience the working of the living spirit like a miracle of healing in the pools of Bethesda. The descent in the depths, as always, seems to precede the ascent. Another theologian dreamed that he saw on a mountain a kind of castle of the Grail. He went along a road that seemed to lead straight to the foot of the mountain and up it. But as he drew nearer, he discovered to his great disappointment that a chasm separated him from the mountain, a deep, darksome gorge with underworldly water rushing along the bottom. A steep path led downwards and toilsomely climbed out up again on the other side. But the prospect looked uninviting, and the dreamer awoke. Here, the dreamer, thirsting for the shining heights, had first to descend into the dark depths, and this proves to be the indispensable condition for climbing any higher. You do have to do the shadow work if you want to get to the white work. The prudent man avoids the danger lurking in the depths, but he also throws away the good, which a bold but imprudent venture might bring. The statement made by the dream meets with violent resistance from the conscious mind, which knows spirit only as something to be found in the heights. Spirit always seems to come from above, while from below, everything that is sordid and worthless. For people who think in this way, spirit means highest freedom, a soaring over the depths, deliverance from the prison of the chthonic world, and hence a refuge for all those timorous souls who do not want to become anything different. The water is earthly and tangible. It is also the fluid of the instinct driven body, blood and the flowing of blood, the odor of the beast, carnality with heavy with passion. The unconscious is the psyche that reaches down from the daylight of mentally and morally lucid consciousness into the nervous system that, for ages, has been known as the sympathetic. Into the nervous system, indeed. This does not govern perception and muscular activity like the cerebrospinal system, and thus controls the environment. But, though functioning without sense organs, it maintains the balance of life and, through the mysterious paths of sympathetic excitation, not only gives us knowledge of the innermost life of other beings, but also has an inner effect upon them. In this sense, it is an extremely collective system, the operative basis of all participation mystique. Whereas the cerebrospinal function reaches its high point in separating off the specific qualities of the ego and only apprehends surfaces and externals, always through the medium of space. It experiences everything as an outside, whereas the sympathetic system experiences everything as an inside. The unconscious is commonly regarded as a sort of encapsulated fragment of our most personal and intimate life, something like what the Bible calls the heart and considers the source of all evil thoughts. In the chambers of the heart dwell the wicked blood spirits, swift anger, and sensual weakness. This is how the unconscious looks when seen from the conscious side, but consciousness appears to be essentially an affair of the cerebrum, which sees everything separately and in isolation, and therefore sees the unconscious in this way too, regarding it outright as my unconscious. Hence, it is generally believed that anyone who descends into the unconscious gets into a suffocating atmosphere of egocentric subjectivity, and in this blind alley is exposed to the attack of all the ferocious beasts which the caverns of the psychic underworld are supposed to harbor. True, whoever looks into the mirror of the water will see first of all his own face. Whoever goes to himself risks a confrontation with himself. Yes, the mirror does not flatter, it faithfully shows whatever looks into it, namely, the face we never show to the world because we cover it with the persona, the mask of the actor. But the mirror lies behind the mask and shows the true faith. And that is where real shadow work lies, right? In getting behind the mask that you present to the world and figuring out your own motivations. This confrontation is the first test of courage on the inner way, a test sufficient to frighten off most people. For the meeting with ourselves belongs to the more unpleasant things that can be avoided so long as we project everything negative into the environment. Huh, boy, if that ain't the truth. But if we are able to see our own shadow and can bear knowing about it, then a small part of the problem has already been solved. We have at least brought up the personal unconscious. The shadow is a living part of the personality and therefore wants to live with it in some form. It cannot be argued out of existence or rationalized into harmlessness. This problem is exceedingly difficult because it not only challenges the whole man, but reminds him at the same time of his helplessness and ineffectuality. Strong natures, or should one rather call them weak, do not like to be reminded of this, but prefer to think of themselves as heroes who are beyond good and evil, and to cut the Gordian knot instead of untying it. Nevertheless, the account has to be settled sooner or later. In the end, one has to admit that there are problems which one simply cannot solve on one's own resources. Such an admission has the advantage of being honest, truthful, and in accord with reality, and this prepares the ground for a compensatory reaction from the collective unconscious. You are now more inclined to give heed to a helpful idea or intuition, or to notice thoughts which had not been allowed to voice themselves before. Perhaps you will pay attention to the dreams that visit you at such moments, or will reflect on certain inner and outer occurrences that take place just at this time. If you have an attitude of this kind, then the helpful powers slumbering in the deeper strata of man's nature can come awake and intervene, for helplessness and weakness are the external experience and the eternal problems of mankind. To this problem, there is also an eternal answer. Otherwise, it would have all been up with humanity long ago. When you have done everything that you could possibly be done, the only thing that remains is what you could still do if only you knew it. But how much do we know of ourselves? Precious little. To judge by the experience, that is true. If you are not intentionally understanding yourself, you probably do not. Hence, there is still a great deal of room left for the unconscious. Prayer, as we know, calls for a very similar attitude and therefore has much the same effect. That is true as well. The necessary and needful reaction from the collective unconscious expresses itself in archetypically formed ideas. The meeting with oneself is, at first, the meeting with one's own shadow. The shadow is a tight passage, a narrow door, whose painful constriction no one is spared who goes down to the deep well. But one must learn to know oneself in order to know who one is. I absolutely agree. For what comes after the door is, surprisingly enough, a boundless expanse full of unprecedented uncertainty, with apparently no inside and no outside, no above and no below, no here and no there, no mine and no thine, no good and no bad, is the world of water, where all life floats in suspension, where the realm of the sympathetic system, the soul of everything living, begins, where I am indivisibly this and that, where I experience the other in myself and the other than myself experiences me. Hmm. No, the collective unconscious is anything but an encapsulated personal system. It is sheer objectivity, as wide as the world and open to all the world. There, I am the object of every subject, in complete reversal of my ordinary consciousness, where I am always the subject that has an object. There, I am utterly one with the world, so much of it that I forget all too easily who I really am. Lost in oneself is a good way of describing this state, but this self is the world, if only a consciousness would see it. This is why we must know who we are. The unconscious no sooner touches us than we are it. We become unconscious of ourselves. That is the age old danger, instinctively known and feared by primitive man, who himself stands so very close to this pleroma. His consciousness is still uncertain, wobbling on its feet. It is still childish, having just emerged from the primal waters. A wave of the unconscious may easily roll over it, and then he forgets who he was and does things that are strange to him. Hence, primitives are afraid of uncontrolled emotions because consciousness breaks down under them and gives way to possession. Who is afraid of uncontrolled emotions? Hmm, that is an interesting thing, huh? Most of society is afraid of uncontrolled emotions. Most of society, especially on the masculine side, is afraid to express emotions, much less to express uncontrolled emotions. Are we all primitives? A man's strivings have therefore been directed towards the consolidation of consciousness. This was the purpose of rite and dogma. They were the dams and walls to keep back the dangers of the unconscious, the perils of the soul. Primitive rites consist, accordingly, in the exercising of spirits, the lifting of spells, the averting of the evil omen, propitiation, purification, and the production by sympathetic magic of helpful occurrences. Now, out of all of these, right, production of sympathetic magic of helpful occurrences, I've got a book on that one. Right, I literally wrote a book about how I used sympathetic magic, the electromagnetic forces of creation, the Holy Spirit, to heal myself in 3 ways, which is now 4, but then was 3, and so I'm on this list for sure. It is these barriers, erected in primitive times, that later become the foundations of the church. It is also these barriers that collapse when the symbols become weak with age. Then the waters rise and boundless catastrophes break over mankind. The religious leader of the Taos Pueblo, the Teos Pueblo, known as the Loco Tenente Gobernador, once said to me, "The Americans should stop meddling with our religion, for when it dies and we can no longer help the Son our Father to cross the sky, the Americans and the whole world will learn something in 10 years' time, for then the sun won't rise any more." In other words, night will fall, the light of the consciousness is extinguished, and the dark sea of the unconscious breaks in. Or they really believe that the sun won't rise. Whether primitive or not, mankind always stands on the. Never underestimate the ability for people to believe things that are fantastical, especially if they are raised to believe that those things are true. Right? And if you are raised to believe that if you don't do this, the sun won't rise, then you believe that, whether or not it is true. Whether primitive or not, mankind always stands on the brink of actions. It performs itself, but does not control. The whole world wants peace, and the whole world prepares for war, to take but one example. Mankind is powerless against mankind, and the gods, as ever, show it in the ways of fate. Today, we call the gods factors, which comes from facere, to make. The makers stand behind the wings of the world theater. It is so in great things as in small. In the realm of consciousness, we are our own masters. We seem to be the factors themselves. That is absolutely true. You are the maker of your reality. The things that you do, the things that you say, and the intentions that you set in your life create your life. But if we step through the door of the shadows, we discover with terror that we are the objects of unseen factors. To know this is deciding that yeah, things can still affect you, right? Like you can live a perfect life and still be mugged. And you can still get cancer and be a holy person. These things are still possible. They are part of the life experience. And that would be the unseen factors. Right? Even if you are doing your best and you are going in the right way, there can still be things that are impossible to avoid. To know this is decidedly unpleasant, for nothing is more disillusioning than the discovery of our own inadequacy. It can even give rise to primitive panic because instead of being believed in, the anxiously guarded supremacy of consciousness, which is in truth one of the secrets of human success, is questioned in the most dangerous way. But since ignorance is no guarantee of security, and in fact only makes our insecurity still worse, it is probably better, despite our fear, to know where the danger lies. To ask the right question is already half the solution of a problem. At any rate, we then know the greatest danger threatening us comes from the unpredictability of the psyche's reactions. Discerning persons have realized for some time that external historical conditions of whatever kind are only occasions, jumping off grounds, for the real dangers that threaten our lives. These are the present politico social delusional systems, We should not regard them casually as necessary consequences of external conditions, but as decisions precipitated by the collective unconscious. I call that a bottleneck. Right? Those unavoidable things that humanity has decided shall be, right? Both of the world wars were an example of that. Humanity as a whole decided we are going to undergo this ordeal, right? Whether or not any of the particular actions were correct, right? On any side, I mean, the Nazis were bad, right? That's not what I'm saying. But the individuals believed that they were doing the right thing. Their collective unconscious as this unit made this decision, and this collective unconscious as this unit made this decision. And together, the decisions that were made it inevitable that the bottleneck of the world wars would occur. Where your individualism comes in is that you get to choose inside of the bottleneck your reaction, just like you do before the bottlenecks get there. Your attitude and direction, your perseverance through is entirely reflective upon you as an individual, right? You get to choose whether or not you are going to send people to the gas chamber. That is a decision that you get to make in your life during the bottleneck. That's an extreme example. Hopefully, will never be again. But the individual themselves had to make the decision, and some decided not to. Some decided to stand in opposition. Schindler was an example. Right? And so you, as the individual, inside of the collective decision, still get to self determine your particular path. And if you are doing it correctly, you're probably going to be all right. That does not mean that you will not endure suffering at some point or that you will not be terminated through suffering at some point. You are still supposed to act in accordance with your true understanding of your relationship with your creator. And so, however you happen to reflect that, right? If you believe in Baptist, they have one reflection, the Methodists have another reflection, and the Pentecostals have an entirely different one, right? However, your reflection of that is, you are called to act in accordance with your understanding of the divine. And so, if the bottleneck occurs and you are called upon to send people to the gas chamber, you are meant to die, right? You are not meant to send people to the chamber. Never, at any point. That is the wrong decision on an individual level every single time. Okay, back to the text. This is a new problem. All the ages before us have believed in gods in some form or other. Only an unparalleled impoverishment of symbolism could enable us to rediscover the gods as psychic factors, that is, as archetypes of the unconscious. No doubt this discovery is hardly credible at present. To be convinced, we need to have the experience pictured in the dream of the theologian, for only then do we experience the self activity of the Spirit moving over the waters. Since the stars have fallen from heaven and our highest symbols have paled, the secret life holds sway in the unconscious. That is why we have a psychology today and why we speak of the unconscious. All of this would be quite superfluous in an age or culture that possess symbols. Symbols are spirit from above, and under those conditions, the spirit is above too. Therefore, it would be a foolish and senseless undertaking for such people that to wish to experience or investigate an unconscious that contains nothing but the silent, undisturbed sway of nature. Our unconscious, on the other hand, hides living water, spirit that has become nature, and that is why it is disturbed. Heaven has become for us the cosmic space of the physicist and the divine empyrean, a fair memory of things that once were. But the heart glows, and a so secret unrest gnaws at the roots of our being. In the words of the Voluspa, we may ask, what murmurs Wotan over Mimir's head? Already the spring boils. Our concern with the unconscious has become a vital question for us, a question of spiritual being or non being. All those who have had an experience like that mentioned in the dream know that the treasure lies in the depths of the water and will try to salvage it. And they must never forget who they are. They must on no account imperil their consciousness. They will keep their standpoint firmly anchored to the earth and will, thus, to preserve the metaphor, become fishers who catch with hook and net what swims in the water. There may be consummate fools who do not understand what fishermen do, but the latter will not mistake the timeless meaning of their action, for the symbol of their craft is many centuries older than the still unfaded story of the Grail. But not every man is a fisherman. Sometimes this figure remains arrested at an early instinctive level, and then it is an otter, as we know from Oscar Schmidt's fairy tales. Whoever looks into the water sees his own image, but behind it, living creatures soon loom up. Fishes, presumably harmless dwellers of the deep, harmless if only the lake were not haunted. They are water beings of a peculiar sort. Sometimes a nixie gets into the fisherman's net, a female half human fish. Nixies are entrancing creatures. Half drew she him, half sank he down, and never more was seen. The nixie is an even more instinctive version of a magical feminine being whom I call the anima. She can be a siren, Melusina, mermaid, wood nymph, grace, or Earl King's daughter, or Lamia, or succubus, who infatuates young men and sucks the life out of them. Moralizing critics say that these figures are projections of soulful emotional states and are nothing but worthless fantasies. One must admit that there is a certain amount of truth in this, but is it the whole truth? Is the Nixie really nothing but a product of moral laxity? Were there not such beings long ago in an age when dawning human consciousness was still wholly bound to nature? Surely there were spirits of forest, field, and stream long before the question of moral conscience ever existed. What is more, these beings were as much dreaded as adored, so that their rather peculiar erotic charms were only one of their characteristics. Man's consciousness was then far simpler, and his possession of it absurdly small. An unlimited amount of what we now feel to be an integral part of our psychic being disports itself merrily for the primitive and projections ranging far and wide. Sorry. The word projection is not really appropriate, for nothing has been cast out of the psyche. Rather, the psyche has attained its present complexity by a series of acts of introjection. Its complexity has increased in proportion to the despiritualization of nature. An alluring Nixie from the dim bygone is today called an erotic fantasy, and she may complicate our psychic life in a most painful way. She comes upon us just as a Nixie might. She sits on top of us like a succubus. She changes into all sorts of shapes like a witch, and in general displays an unbearable independence that does not seem at all proper in a psychic content. Occasionally, she causes states of fascination that rival the best bewitchment, or unleashes terrors in us not to be outdone by any manifestation of the devil. She is a mischievous being who crosses our path in numerous transformations and disguises, playing all kinds of tricks on us, causing happy and unhappy delusions, depressions and ecstasies, outbursts of effects, etc. Even in a state of reasonable introjection, the Nixie has not laid aside her roguery. The witch has not ceased to mix her vile potions of love and death. Her magic poison has been refined into intrigue and self deception, unseen through none, though none the less dangerous for that. But how do we dare to call this elfin being the anima? Anima means soul and should designate something very wonderful and immortal. Yet this was not always so. We should not forget that this kind of soul is a dogmatic conception whose purpose it is to pin down and capture something uncannily alive and active. The German word "sile" is closely related via the Gothic form "sawaldo" to the Greek word "iovos," which means quick moving, changeful of hue, twinkling, something like a butterfly. Wixlin in Greek, which reels drunkenly from flower to flower and lives on honey and love. In Gnostic typology, the psychic man is inferior to the spiritual man. And finally, there are wicked souls who must roast in hell for all eternity. I don't believe that. Even the quite innocent soul of the unbaptized newborn babe is deprived of the contemplation of God. Among primitives, the soul is the magic breath of life, hence the term anima, or a flame. An uncanonical saying of our Lord aptly declares, "Whoso is near unto me is near to the fire." Fire is the spirit. For Heraclitus, the soul at the highest level is fiery and dry, which means it is air, not fire. Because, because this word is such as closely akin to cool breath, this other word means to breathe, to blow. These two mean cold, chill, and damp. Being that being that has soul and living being. Soul is the living thing in man, that which causes of itself, that lives of itself and causes life. Therefore, God breathed into Adam a living breath that he might live. With her cunning play of illusions, the soul lures into life the inertness of matter that does not want to live. She makes us believe incredible things that life may be lived. She is full of snares and traps in order the man should fall, should reach the earth, entangle himself there, and stay caught, so that life should be lived, as Eve in the Garden of Eden could not rest content until she had convinced Adam of the goodness of the forbidden apple. Were it not for the leaping and twinkling of the soul, man would rot away in his greatest passion, idleness. A certain kind of reasonableness is its advocate, a certain kind of morality adds its blessing, but to have soul is the whole venture of life. For soul is a life giving demon who plays his elfin game above and below human existence, to which reason, in the realm of dogma, he is threatened and propitiated with superhuman punishments and blessings that go far beyond the possible deserts of human being. Heaven and hell are the fates meted out to the soul and not to civilized man, who in his nakedness and timidity would have no idea what to do with himself in a heavenly Jerusalem. Hmm. The anima is not the soul in the dogmatic sense, not an anima rationalis, which is a philosophical conception, but a natural archetype that satisfactorily sums up all the statements of the unconscious, of the primitive mind, of the history of language and religion. It is a factor in the proper sense of the word. Men cannot make it. On the contrary, it is always the a priori element in his moods, reactions, impulses, and whatever is spontaneous in psychic life. It is something that lives of itself, that makes us live. It is a life beyond consciousness that cannot be completely integrated with it, but from which, on the contrary, consciousness arises. For in the last analysis, psychic life is, for the greater part, an unconscious life that surrounds consciousness on all sides, a notion that is sufficiently obvious when one considers how much unconscious preparation is needed, for instance, to register a sense impression. Although it seems as if the whole of our unconscious psychic life could be ascribed to the anima, she is yet only one archetype among many. Therefore, she is not characteristic of the unconscious in its entirety. She is only one of its aspects. This is shown by the very fact of her femininity. What is not I, not masculine, is most probably feminine, and because the not I is felt as not belonging to me and therefore as outside me, the anima image is usually projected upon women. Either sex is inhabited by the opposite sex up to a point, or biologically speaking, it is simply the greater number of masculine genes that tips the scale in favor of masculinity. The smaller number of feminine genes seems to form a feminine character, which usually remains unconscious because of its subordinate position. With the archetype of the anima, we enter the realm of the gods, or rather, the realm that metaphysics has reserved for itself. Everything the anima touches becomes numinous, unconditional, dangerous, taboo, magical. She is the serpent in the paradise of the harmless man with good resolutions and still better intentions. She affords the most convincing reasons for not prying into the unconscious, an occupation that would break down our moral inhibitions and unleash forces that had better been left unconscious and undisturbed. As usual, there is something in what the anima says, for life in itself is not good only, it is also bad. Because the anima wants life, she wants what both good and bad. These categories do not exist in the elfin realm. Bodily life as well as psychic life have the impotence to get along much better without conventional morality, and they often remain the healthier for it. The anima believes in the beautiful and the good, a primitive conception that antedates the discovery of the conflict between aesthetics and morals. It took more than 1,000 years of Christian differentiation to make it clear that the good is not always the beautiful, and the beautiful not necessarily good. The paradox of this marriage of ideas troubled the ancients as little as it does the primitives. The anima is conservative and clings in the most exasperating fashion to the ways of earlier humanity. She likes to appear in historic dress with a predilection for Greece and Egypt. In this connection, we would mention the classic anima stories of Rider Haggard and Pierre Benoit, the Renaissance dream known as Hypnerotomachia of Polyphilo, and Gal Gauthier's Faust likewise reached deep into antiquity in order to find a Veramout for the situation. Polyphilo conjured up Queen Venus, Gauthier, Goth, Helen of Troy. Anelia Jaffe has sketched a lively picture of the anima in the age of Biedermeier and the Romantics. If you want to know what happens when the anima appears in modern society, I warmly recommend John Erskine's Private Life of Helen of Troy. She is not a shallow creation, for the breath of eternity lies over everything that is really alive. The anima lives beyond all categories and can, therefore, dispense with blame as well as with praise. Since the beginning of time, man, with his wholesome animal instinct, has been engaged in combat with his soul and its demonism. If the soul were uniformly dark, it would be a simple matter. Unfortunately, this is not so, for the anima can appear also as an angel of light, a psychopomp, who points the way to the highest meaning, as we know from Faust. Have a great day, Jen. Thanks for hanging out. I appreciate it. If the encounter with the shadow is the apprentice piece of the individual's development, then that with the anima is the masterpiece. The relation with the anima is again a test of courage, an ordeal by fire. For the spiritual and moral forces of man, I agree. I have an 24-step process of doing so. Right? Water, fire, combination. We should never forget that in dealing with the anima, we are dealing with psychic facts which have never been in man's possession before, since they were always found outside his psychic territory, so to speak, in the form of projections. For the son, the anima is hidden in the dominating power of the mother, and sometimes she leaves him with a sentimental attachment that lasts throughout life and seriously impairs the fate of the adult. On the other hand, she may spur him to the highest flights. To the man of antiquity, the anima appeared as a goddess or a witch, while for the medieval man, the goddess was replaced by the Queen of Heaven and Mother Church. The desymbolized world of the Protestant produced first an unhealthy sentimentality and then a sharpening of the moral conflict, which, because it was so unbearable, led logically to Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. In centers of civilization, this state shows itself in the increasing insecurity of marriage. The American divorce rate has been reached, if not exceeded, in many European countries, which proves that the anima projects herself by preference on the opposite sex, thus giving rise to magically complicated relationships. That is not an AB relationship there. This fact, largely because of its pathological consequences, has led to the growth of modern psychology, which, in its Freudian form, cherishes the belief that the essential cause of all disturbances is sexuality, a view that only exacerbates the already existing conflict. There is a confusion here between cause and effect. The sexual disturbance is by no means the cause of neurotic difficulties, but is, like these, one of the pathological effects of maladaptation of consciousness, and when consciousness is faced with situations and tasks to which it is not equal. Such a person simply does not understand how the world has altered and what his attitude would have to be in order to adapt to it. In dealing with the shadow or anima, it is not sufficient just to know about these concepts or reflect on them, nor can we ever experience their content by feeling our way into them or by appropriating other people's feelings. It is no use at all to learn a list of archetypes by heart. Archetypes are complexes of experience that come upon us like fate, and their effects are felt in our most personal life. The anima no longer crosses our path as a goddess, but it may be as an intimately personal misadventure, or perhaps as our best venture. When, for instance, a highly esteemed professor in his 70s abandons his family and runs off with a young red-headed actress, we know that the gods have claimed another victim. This is how the demonic power reveals itself to us. Until not so long ago, it would have been an easy matter to do away with the young woman as a witch. That's not a good thing. How many witches died in Salem? Zero. Not a single one. In my experience, there are many, very many people of intelligence and education who have no trouble in grasping the idea of the anima and her relative autonomy, and can also understand the phenomenology of the animus in women. Psychologists have more difficulties to overcome in this respect, probably because they are under no compulsion to grapple with the complex facts peculiar to the psychology of the unconscious. If they are doctors as well, their somatopsychological thinking gets in the way, with this assumption that psychological processes can be expressed in intellectual, biological, or physiological terms. Psychology, however, is neither biology nor physiology, nor any other science than just this knowledge of the psyche. They are intricately linked, however. I mean, being in good physical health is intricately linked to being in good emotional health, which leads into being into good spiritual health. If you are not physically fit, you are more likely to be depressed or anxious. That is a fact. They are coming, like the recent research is showing that over 80% of all depression and anxiety could be fixed with exercise. That is something that is being proven by a multitude of people. Right? It's not just one particular group with an agenda. It is several groups independently researching that almost all instances of depression and anxiety are fixed by the natural chemicals released through exercise. And so it is intricately linked, even though the psyche is really separate from the body most of the time. The picture I have drawn of the anima so far is not complete. Although she may be the chaotic urge to life, something strangely meaningful clings to her, a secret knowledge or hidden wisdom, which contrasts most curiously with her irrational elfin nature. Here, I would like to refer again to the authors already cited. Rider Haggard calls she wisdom's daughter. Benoit's Queen of Atlantis has an excellent library that even contains a lost book of Plato. Ellen of Troy, in her reincarnation, is rescued from a Tyrian brothel by the wise Simon Magus and accompanies him on his travels. I purposely refrained from mentioning this thoroughly characteristic aspect of the anima earlier, because the first encounter with her usually leads one to infer anything rather than wisdom. This aspect appears only to the person who gets to grips with her seriously. Only then, when this hard task has been faced, does he come to realize more and more that behind all her cruel sporting with human fate, there lies something like a hidden purpose which seems to reflect a superior knowledge of life's laws. It is just the most unexpected, the most terrifyingly chaotic things which reveal a deeper meaning. And the more this meaning is recognized, the more the animal loses her impetuous and compulsive character. Gradually, breakwaters are built against the surging of chaos, and the meaningful divides itself from the meaningless. When sense and nonsense are no longer identical, the force of chaos is weakened by their subtraction. Sense is then endued with the force of meaning, and nonsense with the force of meaningless. In this way, a new cosmos arises. This is not a new discovery in the realm of medical psychology, but the age old truth that comes out of the richness of a man's experience. There comes a teaching which the Father can pass on to the Son. In alpha nature, wisdom and folly appear as one and the same, and they are one and the same as long as they are acted out by the anima. Life is crazy and meaningful at once, and when we do not laugh over the one aspect and speculate about the other, life is exceedingly drab and everything is reduced to the littlest scale. There is then little sense and little nonsense either. When you come to think about it, nothing has any meaning, for when there was nobody to think, there was nobody to interpret what happened. Interpretations are only for those who don't understand. It is only the things we don't understand that have any meaning. Man woke up in a world he did not understand, and that is why he tries to interpret it. Thus, the anima and life are meaningless insofar as they offer no interpretation, yet they have a nature that can be interpreted. For in all chaos, there is a cosmos, in all disorder, a secret order, in all caprice, a fixed law, for everything that works is grounded on its opposite. It takes a man's discriminating understanding, which breaks everything down into antinomial judgments, to recognize this. Once he comes to grip with the anima, her chaotic capriciousness will give him cause to suspect a secret order, to sense a plan, a meaning, a purpose over and above her nature, and even, we might be tempted to say, almost be tempted to say, to postulate such a thing, though this would not be in accord with the truth. For in actual reality, we do not have at our command any power of cool reflection, nor does any science or philosophy help us, and the traditional teachings of religion do so only to a limited degree. We are caught and entangled in aimless experience, and the judging intellect, with its categories, proves itself powerless. Human interpretation fails, for a turbulent life situation has arisen that refuses to fit any of the traditional meanings assigned to it. It is a moment of collapse. We sink into a final death. Apuleius calls it a kind of voluntary death. It is a surrender of our own powers, not artificially willed, but forced upon us by nature. Not a voluntary submission and humiliation decked in moral garb, but an utter and unmistakable defeat, crowned with the panic fear of demoralization. Only when all props and crutches are broken, and no cover from the rear offers even the slightest hope of security, does it become possible for us to experience an archetype that, up until then, had lain hidden behind the meaningful nonsense played out by the anima. This is the archetype of meaning, just as the anima is the archetype of life itself. It always seems to us as if meaning, compared with life, were the younger event, because we assume with some justification that we assign it of ourselves, and because we believe, equally rightly, no doubt, that the great world can get along without being interpreted. But how do we assign meaning? From what source, in the last analysis, do we derive meaning? The forms we use for assigning meaning are historical categories that reach back into the mist of time, a fact we do not take sufficiently into account. Interpretations make use of certain linguistic matrices, which are themselves derived from primordial images. From whatever side we approach this question, everywhere we find ourselves confronted with the history of language, with images and motifs that lead straight back to the primitive wonder world. Take, for instance, the word idea. It goes back to the eidos concept of Plato, and the eternal ideas are primordial images stored up in supercelestial place as eternal, transcendent forms. The eye of the seer perceives them as imagines et lares, or as images in dreams and revelatory visions. Or let us take the concept of energy, which is an interpretation of physical events. In earlier times, it was the secret fire of the alchemist or phlogiston, or the heat force inherent in matter, like the primal warmth of the Stoics, or the Heraclitean ever living fire, which borders on the primitive notion of an all pervading vital force, a power of growth and magic healing that is generally called mana. I will not go on needlessly giving examples. It is sufficient to know that there is not a single important idea or view that does not possess historical antecedents. Ultimately, they are all founded on primordial archetypal forms whose concreteness dates from a time when consciousness did not think, but only perceived. Thoughts were objects of inner perception, not thought at all, but sensed as external phenomena, seen or heard, so to speak. Thought was essentially revelation, not invented, but forced upon us or bringing conviction through its immediacy and actuality. Thinking of this kind precedes the primitive ego consciousness, and the latter is more its object than its subject. But we ourselves have not yet climbed the last peak of consciousness, so we also have a pre-existing thinking of which we are not aware, so long as we are supported by traditional symbols, or to put it in the language of dreams, so long as the father or the king is not dead. I would like to give you an example of how the unconscious thinks and paves the way for solutions. It is the case of a young theological student whom I did not know personally. He was in great straits because of his religious beliefs, and about this time, he dreamed the following dream. He was standing in the presence of a handsome old man dressed entirely in black. He knew it was the white magician. This personage had just addressed him at considerable length, but the dreamer could no longer remember what it was about. He had only retained the closing words. And for this, we need the help of the black magician. At that moment, the door opened, and in came another old man, exactly like the first, except that he was dressed in white. He said to the white magician, I need your advice, but threw a sidelong questioning look at the dreamer, whereupon the white magician answered, You can speak freely, he is an innocent. The black magician then began to relate his story. He had come from a distant land where something extraordinary had happened. The country was ruled by an old king who felt his death near. He, the king, had sought out a tomb for himself, for there were in that land a great number of tombs from ancient times, and the king had chosen the finest for himself. According to legend, a virgin had been buried in it. The king caused the tomb to be opened in order to get it ready for use, but when the bones it contained were exposed to the light of day, they suddenly took on life and changed into a black horse, which at once fled into the desert and there vanished. The black magician had heard of this story and immediately set forth in pursuit of the horse. After a journey of many days, always on the tracks of the horse, he came to the desert and crossed to the other side where the grasslands began again. There he met the horse grazing, and there, also, he came upon the find on whose account he now needed the advice of the white magician, for he had found the lost keys of paradise and he did not know what to do with them. At this exciting moment, the dreamer awoke. In the light of our earlier remarks, the meaning of the dream is not hard to guess. The old king is the ruling symbol that wants to go to its eternal rest, and in the very place where similar dominants lie buried. His choice falls fittingly enough on the grave of Anima, who lies in the death trance of Sleeping Beauty, so long as the king is alive. That is, so long as a valid principle, prince, or princeps regulates and expresses life. But when the king draws to his end, she comes to life again and changes into a black horse, which, in Plato's parable, stands for the unruliness of the passions. Anyone who follows this horse comes into the desert, into a wild land, remote from men, an image of spiritual and moral isolation. But there lie the keys of paradise. Now, what is paradise? Clearly, the Garden of Eden with its two faced tree of life and knowledge and its four streams. And the Christian version, it is also the heavenly city of the apocalypse, which, like the Garden of Eden, is conceived as a mandala, but the mandala is a symbol of individuation. So it is the black magician who finds the keys to the solution of the problems of belief, weighing on the dreamer, the keys that open the way of individuation. I believe we begin in the black as well. The contrast between desert and paradise, therefore, signifies isolation as contrasted with individuation or the becoming of the self. This part of the dream is a remarkable paraphrase of the Oxyrhynchus sayings of Jesus, in which the way to the kingdom of heaven is pointed out by animals, and where we find the admonition. Therefore, know that yourselves, for you are the city, and the city is the kingdom. That is one interpretation of that. It is also a paraphrase of the serpent of paradise, who persuaded our first parents to sin, and who finally leads to the redemption of mankind through the Son of God. As we know, this casual nexus gave rise to the ophitic identification of the serpent with the Savior. The black horse and the black magician are half evil elements, whose relativity with respect to good is hinted at in the exchange of garments. The two magicians are indeed two aspects of the wise old man, the superior master and teacher, the archetype of the spirit. Agreed, who symbolizes the pre existent meaning hidden in the chaos of life. He is the father of the soul, and yet the soul, in some miraculous manner, is also his virgin mother, for which reason he was called by the alchemist the first son of the mother. The black magician and the black horse correspond to the descent into darkness in the dreams mentioned earlier. What an unbearably hard lesson for a young student of theology. Fortunately, he was not in the least aware that the father of all prophets had spoken to him in the dream and placed a great secret almost within his grasp. One marvels at the inappropriateness of such occurrences. Why this prodigality? But I have to admit that we do not know how this dream affected the student in the long run. And I must emphasize that, to me at least, the dream had a very great deal to say. It was not allowed to get lost, even though the dreamer did not understand it. The old man in this dream is obviously trying to show how good and evil function together, presumably as an answer with the still unresolved moral conflict in the Christian psyche. With this peculiar relativization of opposites, we find ourselves approaching nearer to the ideas of the East, to the nirvana of Hindu philosophy, the freedom from opposites, which is shown as a possible way of solving the conflict through reconciliation. How perilously fraught with meaning this Eastern relativity of good and evil is can be seen from the Indian aphoristic question: who takes longer to reach perfection, the man who loves God or the man who hates him? And the answer is, he who loves God takes seven reincarnations to reach perfection, and he who hates God takes only three. For he who hates God will think of him more than he who loves him. Freedom from opposite presupposes their functional equivalence, and this offends our Christian feelings. Nevertheless, right, that is an important part of what I do, right? The balancing between the virtues and the vices is directly what is being referred to here, right? You are meant to have lustful intentions and you are meant to be chaste at times, but neither one in excess, right? You are not meant to never have sex. You are not meant to have sex with everyone. You are meant to have sex in a sexual union. You are meant to take pride in the work that you do with the understanding that it doesn't make you worse than anyone else. You are meant to have things, but not necessarily to love those things. And it is the balance that I talk about that is the functional equivalence that does indeed offend Christian feelings quite often. Nonetheless, as our dream example shows, the balanced cooperation of moral opposites is a natural truth, which has been recognized just as naturally by the East. The clearest example of this is to be found in Taoist philosophy, but in the Christian tradition too, there are various sayings that come very close to this standpoint. I need only remind you of the parable of the unjust steward. Our dream is by no means unique in this respect, for the tendency to relativize opposites is a notable peculiarity of the unconscious. One must immediately add, however, that this is true only in cases of exaggerated moral sensibility. In other cases, the unconscious can insist just as inexorably on the irreconcilability of the opposites. As a rule, the standpoint of the unconscious is relative to the conscious attitude. We can probably say, therefore, that our dream presupposes the specific beliefs and doubts of a theological consciousness of a Protestant persuasion. This limits the statement of the dream to a definite set of problems. But even with this paring down of its validity, the dream clearly demonstrates the superiority of its standpoint. Fittingly enough, it expresses its meaning in the opinion and voice of the wise magician, who goes back in direct line to the figure of the medicine man in primitive society. He is, like the anima, an immortal demon that pierces the chaotic darkness of brute life with the light of meaning. He is the enlightener, the master and teacher, a psychopomp whose personification even Nietzsche, that breaker of tablets, could not escape. For he had called up his reincarnation in Zarathustra, the lofty spirit of an almost Homeric age, as the carrier and mouthpiece of his own Dionysian enlightenment and ecstasy. For him, God was dead, but the driving demon of wisdom became, as it were, his bodily double. He himself says, "Then one was changed to two, and Zarathustra passed me by." Zarathustra is more for Nietzsche than a poetic figure. He is an involuntary confession and testament. That is true. Nietzsche, too, had lost his way in the darkness of a life that turned its back upon God and Christianity. And that is why there came to him the revealer and enlightener, the speaking fountainhead of his soul. Here is the source of hieratic language of Zarathustra, for that is the style of this archetype. Nietzsche lamented the fact that he discovered, right, that the dogma was wrong, right? And he was like, oh, this is wrong. I'm going to let everybody know. And that's what he was trying to do. And he alienated all of his friends because he was trying to alienate them from Christianity. That is entirely what is contained in Zarathustra, right? Now, it gives you the breakdown of his mental loss because of the loss of friendship and companionship. That was the outflow of that, right? And I can attest that that is the outflow of that, right? So that is exactly what happened. Like he was he was trying to become something better, right? The Uberman was not genetic manipulation, but you becoming the best you. And that's what he was trying to do. And he was really frustrated that nobody else was even interested in doing that at all. And he became overwhelmed with depression because of that. Modern man, in experience in this archetype, comes to know the most ancient form of thinking as an autonomous activity whose object he is. Hermes Trismegistus, or the Teote of Hermetic literature, Orpheus, the Poimandres, shepherd of men, and his near relation to the Poimen of Hermes are other formulations of the same experience. If the name Lucifer were not prejudicial, it would be a very suitable one for this archetype. But I have been content to call it the archetype of the wise old man or of meaning. Like all archetypes, it has a positive and negative aspect, although I don't want to enter into that here. The reader will find a detailed exposition of the two facedness of the wise old man in the phenomenology of the spirit in fairy tales that might be part of this work that we are working through. The three archetypes so far discussed are the shadow, the anima, and the wise old man, are of a kind that can be directly experienced in personified form. In the foregoing, I tried to indicate the general psychological conditions in which such an experience arises, but what I conveyed were only abstract generalizations. One could, or rather should, really give a description of the process as it occurs in immediate experience. In the course of this process, the archetypes appear as active personalities in dreams and fantasies. But the process itself involves another class of archetypes, which one could call the archetypes of transformation. They are not personalities, but are typical situations, places, ways, and means that symbolize the kind of transformation in question. Like the personalities, these archetypes are true and genuine symbols that cannot be exhaustively interpreted, either as signs or as allegories. They are genuine symbols precisely because they are ambiguous, full of half glimpsed meanings, and in the last resort, inexhaustible. The ground principles, the apex of the unconscious, are indescribable because of their wealth of reference, although in themselves recognizable. The discriminating intellect naturally keeps on trying to establish their singleness of meaning and thus misses the essential point for what we can above all establish as the one thing consistent with their nature is their manifold meaning, their almost limitless wealth of reference, which makes any unilateral formulation impossible. Besides this, they are in principle paradoxical, for just as the alchemist in spirit was conceived as senexit evura simul, an old man and a youth at once, both masculine and feminine even. If one wants to form a picture of the symbolic process, the series of pictures found in alchemy are good examples, though the symbols they contain are for the most part traditional, despite their often obscure origin and significance. An excellent Eastern example is the Tantric chakra system, or the mystical nerve system of the Chinese yoga. That is very close to what I do. It also seems, and like that was revealed to me, and then I found it. So it also seems as if the set of pictures in the tarot cards were distantly descended from the archetypes of transformation, a view that has been confirmed for me in a very enlightening lecture by Professor Bernoulli. The symbolic process is an experience in images and of images. Its development usually shows in a diadromean structure like the text of the I Ching, and so presents a rhythm of negative and positive, loss and gain, dark and light. Its beginning is almost invariably characterized by one's getting stuck in a blind alley or some impossible situation, and its goal is, broadly speaking, illumination or higher consciousness, by means of which the initial situation is overcome on a higher level. As regards the time factor, the process may be compressed into a single dream, or into a short moment of experience, or it may extend over months and years, depending on the nature of the initial situation, the person involved in the process, and the goal to be reached. The wealth of symbols naturally varies enormously from case to case, although everything is experienced in image form. An example, symbolically. It is by no means a question of fictitious dangers, but of very real risks upon which the fate of the whole life may depend. The chief danger is that of succumbing to the fascinating influence of the archetypes, and this is most likely to happen when the archetypal images are not made conscious. If there is already a predisposition to psychosis, it may even happen that the archetypal figures, which are endowed with a certain autonomy anyway, on account of their natural numinosity, will escape from conscious control altogether and become completely independent, thus producing the phenomena of possession. In the case of an anima possession, for instance, the patient will want to change himself into a woman through self castration. He is afraid that something of the sort will be done to him by force, or he is afraid. The best known example of this is Schreber's Memoirs of My Nervous Illness. Now we know why they don't use Freud, why they don't use Jung, right? They use Freud. I said it was because of victim blaming, but this is equally valid. Patients often discover a whole anima mythology with numerous archaic motifs. A case of this kind was published some time ago by Nelkin. Another patient has described his experiences himself and commented on them in a book. I mention these examples because there are still people who think that the archetypes are subjective chimeras of my own brain. The things that come to light brutally in insanity remain hidden in the background in neuroses, but they continue to influence consciousness nevertheless. When, therefore, the analysis penetrates the background of conscious phenomena, it discovers the same archetypal figures that activate the deliriums of psychotics. Finally, there is any amount of literary and historical evidence to prove that in the case of these archetypes, we are dealing with normal types of fantasy that occur practically everywhere and not with the monstrous products of insanity. The pathological element does not lie in the existence of these ideas, but in the dissociation of consciousness that can no longer control the unconscious. In all cases of dissociation, it is therefore necessary to integrate the unconscious into consciousness. This is a synthetic process which I have termed the individuation process. As a matter of fact, this process follows the natural course of life, a life in which the individual becomes what he always was. Because man has consciousness, a development of this kind does not run very smoothly. Often it is varied and disturbed because consciousness deviates again and again from its archetypal, instinctual foundation and finds itself in opposition to it. There then arises the need for a synthesis of the two positions. This amounts to psychotherapy even on a primitive level, where it would take the form of restitution ceremonies. As examples, I would mention the identification of the Australian Aborigines with their ancestors in the Alcharinga period, identification with the sons of the sun among the Pueblos of Taos, the Helios apotheosis in the Isis mysteries, and so on. Accordingly, the therapeutic methods of complex psychology consist on the one hand in making as fully conscious as possible the constellated unconscious contents, and on the other hand in synthesizing them with consciousness through the act of recognition. Since, however, civilized man possesses a high degree of dissociability and makes continual use of it in order to avoid every possible risk, it is by no means a foregone conclusion that recognition will be followed by the appropriate action. On the contrary, we have to reckon with the singular ineffectiveness of recognition and must, therefore, insist on a meaningful application of it. Recognition by itself does not, as a rule, do this, nor does it imply, as such, any moral strength. That is why you have to do the whole cycle and not just the one part of it. In these cases, it becomes very clear how much the cure of neurosis is a moral problem. As the archetypes, like all numinous contents, are relatively autonomous, they cannot be integrated simply by rational means, but require a dialectical procedure, a real coming to terms with them, often conducted by the patient in dialogue form, so that, without knowing it, he puts into effect the alchemical definition of the meditatio, an inner colloquy with one's good angel. Usually, the process runs a dramatic course with many ups and downs. It expresses itself in or is accompanied by dream symbols that are related to the representations collectives, which, in the form of mythological motifs, have betrayed psychic processes of transformation since the earliest times. In the short space of a lecture, I must content myself with giving only a few examples of archetypes. I have chosen the ones that play the chief part in an analysis of the masculine psyche, and have tried to give you some idea of the transformation process in which they appear. Since this lecture was first published, the figures of the shadow, anima, and wise old man, together with the corresponding figures of the feminine unconscious, have been dealt with in greater detail in my contributions to the symbolism of the self, and the individuation process in its relation to alchemical symbolism has also been subjected to closer investigation. And that's going to bring us to the end of the collective or the first part, right? Next, tomorrow or Monday, we'll be picking up with the concept of the collective unconscious. Hopefully, I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a series of somewhat difficult concepts. I do understand that I hold some unconventional beliefs, and I do have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, and it is not something that I apologize for. I feel like I do have a fairly firm grip on all of the things that he is discussing. And the points that I clarified, I feel like are actual clarification points. A lot of this is reworking ground, right? This is in anticipation of Ion, and I'm really trying to hold a whole lot of the take the time to discuss for Ion. If you are unaware of all of these things, right, I do have resources that are available. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow, throw me a comment. Whether you agree or disagree with anything that was stated, put it in the box, and if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you've truly found value, hit me with the super thanks. Consider joining for a membership. picking up a copy of one of my books, which is those resources I was talking about, right? The manipulation of the electromagnetic spirits of the forces of creation, which is the Holy Spirit, how I healed myself. That's the first one. The second one is the completion of the Mysterium Conjunctionis, the terminology of alchemy, further defined, the practical application in a broader scale, also further defined. And the house built upon shifting sands is a biblical deconstruction of the Bible using the Bible. Uh, or you can reach out to me through the links provided down below. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete, just the way that you are. And this has been Pittstake. Peace.